My dear friends, have you ever played with a magnet? I'm sure just about every one of us has experimented with magnets. I remember as a child putting a little magnet on the table and surrounding it with pins. And the pins were far enough away not to be within the range of the magnet. But then I would push the pins closer and closer. And then the pins would begin to quiver. You could see them quivering. I had moved them within the range of the magnet, but they weren't yet in far enough to be impacted by the full power of the magnet. But they were feeling the power of the magnet, and they were shaking, they were quivering. And then I pushed them a little more, and then they were pulled into the magnet. And then what is very fascinating is that each of those pins became a magnet. Each of those pins from that point on was able to draw other pins to themselves. So I think it's an extraordinary image to think about, to understand God. The magnet. It's a beautiful image. And it's a beautiful image to describe the spiritual journey. Because the truth is, God is a magnet. And the energy of his magnetism is the energy of love. And you see, today is the feast of the Blessed Trinity, the most holy Trinity. An extraordinary feast of our church. But what does the Trinity mean to you? What does it mean to me? Do I get excited when I think about the feast of the Trinity? Or do I just take it in stride? And I think most people just take it in stride. They're so used to it. They're so used to hearing about the Blessed Trinity. It doesn't really impact them anymore. So the feast comes and the feast goes and life goes on. And we're not impacted by this extraordinary feast. Because really we don't understand it. We can't quite deal with it. And what is the Trinity? What is the feast of the Blessed Trinity? It's a feast of love. Today we're celebrating love. Today we're celebrating the fact that God is love. You see, God is made up of three persons. What is that saying to us? It's saying to us that God is the energy of love ever happening. God is not static. God is active. God is actively experiencing love. God is actively involved in the interaction of love. That's what the Trinity is saying to us. God is love. God is active love. God is dynamic love. God is energetic love. God is a magnet of love. And God is trying to draw us all into the magnetism of his love. And that's what the Trinity is saying. It's an extraordinary concept. But we miss it. We move on, and we're not impacted by it. A very holy man in the history of the church was a man by the name of Brother Lawrence. He lived centuries ago. And Brother Lawrence was a brother in a monastery. He wasn't a priest. He was a brother. And he worked all day in the kitchen. He did the cooking for the monks, for the priests. And he was a very holy man. And yet all he did all day long was do the cooking and keep the kitchen clean. And the priests in that monastery, they would go to him for spiritual direction because they realized He was a very holy man. And the priests were the teachers. They taught theology. They were the learned ones. And yet they were coming to this brother who was the cook. And they were looking for spiritual direction. And Brother Lawrence used to say that theological discussions bored him. He had no interest in theological discussions. Because Brother Lawrence had the truth. He understood what his faith was all about. It was all about practicing the presence of God. All day long he practiced the presence of God. He felt God in his presence at every moment. As he was doing the cooking, he would be thinking about God right there with him. And he became so good at this that he was never not aware of the presence of God. And he was never not aware of the extraordinary love of God. But he had no interest in the intellectual. And yet he had the secret. And the problem is, we get lost in the intellectual. And that's why we have trouble with the Blessed Trinity. I'd say most of us can explain what the Blessed Trinity is. We say, well, the Blessed Trinity means there are three persons in God: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that's true. But that's all intellectual. We're just explaining in concepts what God is all about. But the concepts really do nothing for us. They don't touch the heart. And you see, if your heart isn't touched, your religion is really a waste. It's all about having our hearts touched. You see, we are pins. We are the pins. And the magnet is God. The magnet is the love of God. But we're out there so far, we're not even feeling the impact of that love. And we're scared to come close, because if we become close, we begin to quiver. And we don't want to quiver. We get scared and we move away again. Because love will force you to quiver. Because love is asking us to surrender. We don't want to surrender. We want to be in control. And when you start quivering, you don't feel you're in control. So we stay away from the quivering. We stay outside the range of God's love. And the spiritual journey is a journey into the range of God's love, where we can be pulled into his heart. And we too can become magnets of love. You see, a lot of people are still paying their dues. And that's how they see religion. They have this image of God on the last day asking them, well, how well did they do in life? So they feel, well, I went to Mass every Sunday, I said my prayers every day, I was good to my neighbor. So when I meet my God on the last day, he will be happy that I paid my dues. And that's such a very, very empty image of God. It's shallow. That's not the true God at all. Anyone who follows that line of thinking doesn't know God. God is love. God is nothing else but love. A very good spiritual writer is Father John Maine, a Benedictine. And Father John Maine, in talking about the Blessed Trinity, he says, the Blessed Trinity is the very being of God. What the Blessed Trinity is saying to us is that God is an ongoing explosion of the energy of love. That's how John Maine puts it. God is an ongoing explosion of the energy of love, because the energy of the Trinity lives within him. And the energy of the Trinity is constantly exploding. It's love exploding. That's how John Maine explains it. And he said that's the very being of God. That's the very life of God. The love energy just exploding and drawing the whole world into itself. And you see, God is the ground of our being. God is the ground of your being. He's the ground of my being. But we've drifted so far away from the ground of our being that we don't know where we come from. We forget that the ground of our being is love. And God is trying to pull us back into the ground of our being. But we're scared to come back. We're lost out there somewhere, and we're feeling lonely and lost. And we long for love. And God is love. But we don't know that we long for love. We think we long for something else. And we go running after something else, and we discover that it doesn't satisfy. There is only one thing that satisfies, and that is love. That's what Jesus is telling us. It's all about love. Today's feast is all about love. Another great saint of the church, St. John of the Cross, wrote some beautiful poetry. And he said his only occupation was love. Can you imagine that? Going through life, and your only occupation is love. And John of the Cross is telling us that as we go through life, our only occupation should be love. But you see, we don't understand that, because we don't understand love. We have such confused ideas about love. And the gospel is filled with the truth of love. The gospel is trying to convey to us what love is. But so many magazines try to tell us what love is, and what they're telling us what love is not. St. John of the Cross, a great saint, he said his only occupation was love. God's only occupation is love. God created the world for one reason, love. God is keeping us alive for one reason, love. No other reason. God is not interested in anything else. And he's telling us, until we come to know that, and until we come to trust love and surrender into love, we will never know what the Trinity is. We will never know who God